Well, hello and welcome to our webinar, Solving Our Industry's Lockout Tagout Challenges. Voovio is hosting this webinar based on discussions and interactions with many of our customers, companies, and sites that we've visited over the last 6 months across the country. And a common recurring topic that we hear is related to lockout, tagout, and the manufacturing challenges that the teams are encountering. And they're looking for new and different ideas on how to prevent the lockout, tagout incidents and events. So in this webinar, we're going to hear from two industry leaders about their experiences related to addressing lockout, tagout. And we hope others in the audience will share their experiences and some of the best practices that they've employed and they've found to be successful. So with that, let me introduce two of the senior leaders that are with us. Brock Ryan, he's a director of operations at SABIC's largest U.S. manufacturing site in Mount Vernon, Indiana. Brock's held various production, EHS, and leadership positions over the 22 years of his career with both GE Plastics and SABIC. And secondly, we have David Mahalik. David, he's the EHS Hub Director at BASF in Geismar, Louisiana. That's BASF's largest U.S. site. He's an expert in the EHS and field and has a lot of experience in the industry. He's been with BASF for 25 years, and prior to that, he was at 15 years at Dow in various production project and EHS roles. Also with me is my colleague, Clint Jeffes. Both Clint and I have many years experience in manufacturing. So with that, let's get started with the webinar. Again, thank you, Brock. Thank you, David, for joining Clint and I today. So lockout, tagout. You know, this standard has been around the industry since 1989. The standard was first introduced by OSHA. And according to OSHA, they believe this standard saves about 120 lives annually. And you know, we can avoid up to 50,000 injuries annually by just complying to this standard. Not to mention the significant lost time that our employees, realize when involved in a lockout, tagout incident. So again, a serious standard, a life-saving rule, as many companies refer to it as. So compliance is key. Avoiding the fatalities and injuries, we all need to comply with the lockout standard. So looking at the most recent data that's published by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics for chemical manufacturing, control of hazardous energy is the standard with the highest number of citations. And you can see down the left side some of the top reasons for non-compliance. It's failing to have an established energy control procedure. It's the inadequate employee training, and then the absence of periodic inspection and evaluation of the lockout, tagout procedure. So let's look at those three categories of compliance issues according to OSHA. The first one is around procedures. If we look at the standard written by OSHA, the wording is quite simple and clear. However, implementation is left up to the owner-operator to define and document, and this interpretation that each company and site must consider and determine how detailed, how prescriptive they want to be versus the standard. And I think that begins the challenge within the sites is writing that procedure that meets the minimum requirements, as well as maximizing the impact and reducing that risk to the employees. And if some of these minimums and some of these, inconsistencies are around locks and tags, locks or tags, the implementation of the tri-step, and then do you have prescriptive lockout lists, or do you have them written at the time of need? So there's a lot of challenges around detailing those requirements. OSHA is very clear. Once they're detailed, you must follow them. So it's that is where I'd like to start the initial discussion and David and Brock's input on how do you establish that minimum requirement to minimize the risk, and what has your experience been in establishing the right procedure?
Yeah, Fran, as you noted, the standard has been around for 33 years. I was fortunate enough, or I'm old enough to have been involved in the front end of that. And when OSHA came out with this standard originally, it was just lockout. And when they proposed the standard, they did not recognize that tags were as good as, or better in many cases, as just a lockout system. We as industry worked with OSHA to convince them that we had tag out systems that had been established and in place 20 plus years back, even back in 1989, and that we could manage those. We did work with OSHA to beef up some of those requirements around the 50-pound pull strength and things like that for the tags. But really, this was an industry pushback on OSHA that really made this a much safer standard in my view.
And from my perspective, erring on the side of safety is always the most important thing. And so the more that you can be prescriptive on what your requirements are and be very clear with your employees, the better. For us, the last slide said tag or lock. We do both tag and lock. We do key verification points, which make sure that your energy sources is not there. There's not any stored energy. And then we also do the tri-step, which is one of the most important steps before you do any type of equipment. You want to make sure that that pump is turned off and that it doesn't fire whenever you put it on, because we've seen instances where the connector can be disconnected, can still be live even though you've hit the box. So that tri-step is the most important thing to make sure you keep someone safe. So I think that's the most important thing from my perspective when it comes to risk versus requirement.
Yeah, Brock, that's a great point, because as our systems have become more complex, where we've got DCS systems now that give affirmatives, things like that, it's sometimes more difficult to assert whether or not a system is truly isolated from an energy standpoint. So it's important that we understand those. And I think what we've done over the years as industry is adapt those type of things. There was a lot of changes came out in the mid 2000s around inadvertent operation, for example, and that is the requirement that let's say you have a quarter turn valve, that someone can't accidentally bump it and introduce energy into the system unintentionally. So I think that's really the key to this standard. It's 33 years old, but we as industry have adapted as we've learned things. We also have a new groups of younger people coming into the industry now that really understand some of the electronic parts of the things, of the DCS systems, et cetera, but may not understand the basics of how we run our plants. So it's important that we continue that adaptation as we go along.
Yeah, so Brock, you made a good point about the site using locks and tags. However, we've seen as we've gone across companies, individual companies, but different sites choose to implement or employ lockout, tag out. Some don't use tags or some don't use locks. In your all experiences, have you guys encountered that, and how do you manage the different standards across different sites within the same company?
For us, and at least in the U.S. based industry, we all are standard on our approach from using locks and tags. I think that's an important thing within your company, that you do the same thing, because if there are instances where we do share operators, where we might send somebody to another plant, during a turnaround period of time, then it's important that you have the consistency amongst those that you will support. And so I think that's the most important thing as a company can do, is be consistent, at least within region to region. But as a corporation would be even preferred. And so I think that's where we've tried to standardize from America's standpoint for SABIC, is always the important things are the tag, the lock, and then the KVP, as well as the tri-step. Those are the four things that you have to have, and has to be in place, has to be universal for us.
That's good.
Yep, and I think that's key also to understand that, though, that many of us are using third parties to perform maintenance, particularly in turnaround scenarios. And I may bring in a crew that was at SABIC, is at BASF, and we may not have exactly the same standards. So making sure that those personnel understand the requirements of our systems, and that we are consistent in applying them across our site or sites is essential. And I can tell you from our perspective, we also have a number of pipelines that cross into other users within the community that we operate our plants, and isolating those, because we all recognize that we do have different systems. The isolation of those, we actually have a set procedure amongst the various companies to make sure that we all are following the same standard in isolating those and not putting other people at harm or the community.
It's a good point, David. So to pick up on one of your comments about, making it clear to the end user, that's one of the key points on here is how do you ensure it is clear to the end user? We use a term called procedure clarity. It's really ensuring the written word is clear, so when the operator or the mechanic goes to execute, they're executing it the right way.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fran. Part of, lockout tagout is really just part of a whole series of procedures that we have in place to keep our employees, keep the community, and keep those third parties that are working in our plants safe. We have to do some type of safe work permitting system. I think all of us in industry use that. And that is really how we communicate a lot of what we do, along with the training that we give those folks when they come into our plants and facilities. The real key, though, is that communication at the point of the transfer of responsibility, if you will. And if we're not doing a good job with that, we will make mistakes. So we really focus a lot of our training and effort and really auditing and evaluation based off of what we do at that point of contact.
Good.
Yeah, I think that's similar to what we do, where anybody who comes into our site goes through an orientation period where for a week you're only focusing on EHS standards and practices, just so you at least have an idea of what our rules and regulations are, and life-saving rules are one of those items that we hit, which is LOTO is one of the life-saving rules. And I think that's important to just share with everyone. I think we'll maybe get into a little bit later on the actual training part, but when the hands-on training, there's nothing better than actually to do hands-on training for any individual that's going to do LOTO or going to be a receiver of something that is LOTO, so you understand what the requirements are. And if you see something that doesn't look right, that you stop and you get the operation of a responsible person, so that you can actually ensure that the device is LOTO'd as intended.
Excellent point, Brock. Thank you, David. So you led me right into training. So let's talk about training, because that was one of the compliance findings from OSHA. So again, the standard is pretty clear. It highlights knows, understands, and follows. And it's really about ensuring the employee knows, understands, and follows the written procedure. And so I pulled this excerpt out of a 2019 EHS article that had a comment around the 572 violations related to training and communications. And within that article was a very pointed statement about companies need to ensure that what they've implemented around lockout, tagout is truly around reducing, eliminating injuries, and saving lives, not just something to meet a compliance or meet the regulatory requirements. So with that as the backdrop, what's been your experience? How do you define, or what have you seen that is effective training? And Brock, you may have just touched on it, and that's the hands-on piece, but maybe you guys can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, for us, training is continuing to evolve. For us right now, we do the classroom training to help educate on LOTO procedures and policy and what that is. And then it's the application and the hands-on training that I think pays the biggest benefit. When you actually get to touch and you get to do a LOTO in a safe environment, it makes it extremely important for the person to help recognize and understand what they're trying to do and the dangers that they're trying to avoid. And so we've actually have a new employee center at our facility in Mount Vernon that we get to walk people through LOTO and LOTO training on that is just has water on it, so the risk is less, but it helps people do that. And then you can, purposely put things in place that are wrong to help them catch it. And I think that's a good exercise to do, is to think about what are those scenarios where something might not go right, or you might miss something, and how do you make sure people are doing an effective job of doing that. So the hands-on piece is extremely important when it comes to LOTO training. The classroom is great and you can have the knowledge, but if you don't have the application, you can make mistakes. And I think that's the important thing, is to really help put it in perspective and put it out there for everyone to see and to feel.
Yeah, and it's really, when you talk about what is effective training, it's really different for everybody, but you really have to, when you set your training programs up, you've got to set them up for understanding, what is really your audience in doing this. And if you're doing this with a turnaround in mind, or if you're doing it with embedded maintenance in mind, you need to approach that differently, because your culture internally versus your culture of a turnaround work crew may be different, and how you approach that needs to be different as well. When you start talking about post-COVID and seeing a lot of turnover, that type of thing, it becomes very, I think you have to adapt what you're doing. If you do not adapt these, and particularly if you've got leading indicators that are saying you do have issues, that you're not doing a great job with it, you really have to be willing and ready to adapt those scenarios. So, and as far as knowing and understanding, one thing that we push is the concept of 4 eyes, where, typically the people who isolate our equipment are the owners of the equipment. And they have the most knowledge of the processes. They read the P&IDs, they do all that. And then the maintenance crews, if you will, in most cases for us, are third parties. They have to do what I call trust but verify. They need to walk out there with the equipment owners, review the isolation, and make sure they're comfortable with it. And the third part of this that comes into play, in my view, is there has to be what I would call a stop work responsibility. If either party is uncomfortable with what they see or doesn't fully understand it, there has to be a willingness of people to speak up and say, whoa, I don't think this is correct, or I don't understand this isolation, or I'm just simply not comfortable with this. Let's take a step back. That's the culture part, because there can't be repercussions for doing that. It has to be celebrated when this happens, even if in the end you decide what's there is safe. You have to have that as part of your culture, and that has to be part of your training.
Yeah, I 100% agree with the recognition part too. That's the most important thing, is when somebody does find something, even if they just have a concern, and you validate that it was correct, thank the person for taking the extra time and recognize them for that piece, because one of these days that could be something that was wrong, and they won't feel concerned at all about raising that. And I think that's the culture you want to provide and have your folks in. So that's a great point, David.
Yeah, excellent points around culture. That's significant. So just to maybe build a little bit, because I think both maybe covered the second question, but years ago, back whenever I was still in the manufacturing organizations, I had my manufacturing director come, and he asked, how do you know? How do you, as a senior leader of the site, how do you know that your employees know and understand?
That's a great question, and I guess my answer would be multifaceted. There are the typical audits. There are the permit reviews, the isolation reviews, and the follow-up when you find something is not done correctly, and the sharing of lesson learned, and not necessarily just within the company either. And I think through many of our organizations, we all safety is the one area that we all can agree to share information on. So if I have something that occurs at my site, near miss or otherwise, and near misses are just as important, by the way, as actual incidents. But you also have to have the robustness of your processes to make sure there are additional layers of protection there also, because there will be, much as we've tried over the years, there's going to be mistakes made. There's going to be, you have a pipe go up into a pipe rack, and whoever's tracing it jumps from one 2-inch line to another, and you're gonna have those mistakes made. But making sure that you properly, the lock tag the try part is really the key to doing a lot of this. And if people are not doing that try part, if they're not understanding what they're doing, then you're gonna have confront problems.
I think that the know and understand part is also around if you could do the hands-on training, if that could be a step in your training journey, you understand the procedures you can test on, you understand those, but then when you apply it, now you're applying what you should understand, and then you have somebody who is trained and fully certified on LOTO can then verify that person actually did what they're supposed to do in a controlled environment before you put them out into the real atmosphere. The other thing is around, especially on more complex LOTOs, P&ID walk downs, and giving somebody understanding of how a plant's supposed to look and how do you go do a effective LOTO. It all starts with a P&ID and then verifying in the field. I think that's another step that's really important. And again, it takes a more experienced operator to understand all that, but it starts with the beginning on. In my mind, again, I'll say it over and over, the hands-on training for me is the most important thing, and the thing that we've seen the biggest impact on our ability to execute things in a proper manner.
Yeah, and most of us have isolation procedures for our equipment. And we also have to recognize that between the time you isolated this reactor last time and the time you isolated this time, there may very well be a management of change that has occurred, a new tie-in, a change in the system. Most of us have the robustness of our systems to update those procedures and all that, but you always have to take the assumption that something could have been missed, and you need to be thorough in what you do.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next. I think Clint's gonna jump in and take control of this. Clint, you're on mute.
Yep, getting it going, getting my screen up and running. Sharing screen. Now.
There you go.
Okay, so what we've got going on here, where we're going to move next is about responsibility and execution. Who's responsible, and we're going to talk about whose responsibility when it comes to lockout, tag out, who owns that. So as we move forward, we talk, in 1910, what it says is, lockout, the standard says it's the employer's responsibility to protect employees from hazardous energy. Also, that the employee has a responsibility to conduct some periodic inspection of the energy control procedure and ensure that those requirements are being followed. So again, into the standard, now to the discussion of, and you guys' opinion, who is ultimately accountable for auditing that performance against the standard?
So, there's an old saying that says you can delegate authority, but not a responsibility. And we really believe that's the case. I think accountability is on both parties, the maintenance crew, whether it be internal maintenance or outside, and the equipment owners. The equipment owners have a responsibility to make the equipment safe before anybody does any work on it, whether they're doing that work themselves or a third party's doing it, or however you do that. So, but in my view, it's a joint responsibility. And again, that's why we promote and push the idea of a four eyes concept, where we have that shared responsibility. Auditing wise, we actually go beyond that. We do auditing with management, we do auditing with EHS, and then we do peer-to-peer auditing. So I think all three of those are factors that need to be done by anybody. So
I think Dave hit it right on the head. So, I mean, for us, operations is responsible for the lotto. Both parties are accountable for ensuring that the lotto is done correctly. And again, and also raising concerns like Dave mentioned earlier, if they find something that it doesn't look right, raise it up and we'll reevaluate it. And the other part on, the person doing the work's the one who has the most risk at that point. So making sure that tri-step is done, and they actually, even if the lotto person already verified it, doing it themselves, I think is extremely important, just to make sure before you do any work. So I think it's all of the above. And the auditing performance, we typically have our operating teams, our EHS teams, and then we also have contractors also, or maintenance folks, as David said, do audits to ensure that things are done correctly. So I think I think everyone has responsibility and accountability when it comes to lotto.
Good deal. Great. So I guess the next piece of it is, this standard's been in place for over 30 years, longer than I've certainly been in industry. What is you guys' take on why this remains such a significant concern when it comes to incidents and citations from OSHA?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it's been the standard with OSHA has been in place for 30 plus years, but I can tell you in industry, it's been 60 plus years. We all had isolation processes in place, at least in major industry, for years and years. And a lot of what was put in place in 1989 was the shampoo filling bottle type of thing, where people would not isolate equipment. They'd put their hands in it and end up with a crushed hand or broken arm or something like that. And when we went to OSHA in 1989 and said, hey, we need the ability to do, we can't, if I have a 700 point isolation on a reactor system, hauling around the number of locks and chains that would be required to do that is just, it's introducing hazards. So, but a lot of our systems are very complex, and that's really the key. And that's why I think over the years OSHA said, when it originally came out, you didn't have to have the written lockout procedures. That's something really that was added over the years. So, as I mentioned, the 1+ isolation, we all learn from our mistakes. We learn from our standards, but it is. I can't speak for Brock, but I know on my site there's probably hundreds of lockouts occurring every day. So if you look at that over the course of a year and the course of the industry, you're talking millions of isolations. So there's going to be, and I want to say, we're not perfect. We strive for perfection, but we train for perfection, but we're not there. So it's going to remain a significant concern. I would say a lot of the citations that do occur are probably not in the big industrial players. It's more in the smaller ones that don't have as robust a programs. So
I think also, there's a couple of things that why they remain concerns when we do management change. I think David mentioned that before, making sure that all the documents are updated appropriately, to make sure the P&IDs are up to date, everything else, so that when somebody's doing a lotto package, that those valves or tie points are in there, I think is important. The other thing is lotto is still related on a person doing the role. So the behavior of an individual and a culture you create is what's really important to make sure significant compliance. And so for me, the behavior piece, that for us as leaders to have consequences, both positive and negative, around lotto and ensuring that we do the right things, as well as always instilling that what I would consider like the chronic sense of unease for our teams to always look for something that's wrong. Not that I've done this a million times and this is a simple procedure. Always consider what could go wrong and have that chronic sense of unease. And to me, that is what is the difficult part, is to create that culture and keep that culture, because we do turn over people over years, and we are going through, I know, a retirement cliff. So we're getting a lot of new folks in, and a lot of people that have been doing this for 30 plus years are retiring. And so it's important to really instill that culture from day one when somebody comes onto the site. And that's the most important thing, and why lotto is continuing to be a concern for us, because it's a very big deal for anyone working, but also anyone who's preparing that line. And we need to create that culture where where people understand the importance of LOTO.
Yep. The other thing I would comment to, and many of us work in plants that have, shall we say, we're not dealing necessarily with just water and air. So, when you get in situations where you have materials that plug, materials that polymerize, things like that, an isolation that may be written to isolate a particular piece of equipment. When you get into that isolation, you find a valve that's not functioning. You find something that's not holding, it's leaking by. You have to modify that lockout. That's when typically, if we have issues, that's typically when those issues are occurring, when we're having to modify the isolation that we are doing. That's when we have to put our heads together and really think about what we're doing on these.
Yep, all wonderful points. Yeah, appreciate it. Good discussion. So as we move forward, the question becomes, okay, now we've heard the issues and what some people are doing. What are the next steps to trying to continue to progress and limit our exposure when it comes to the magnitude of the risk that's just inherent with isolation of energy and lockout tagout? So we talk about best practices and those key drivers, things you've heard so far, clarity of procedure, trained employees, responsibility, understanding, and then effective auditing. As we get into these questions with the experts, we're also going to launch a poll for our attendees. So if you guys have some of these best practices, please share in our link here. You should see it now showing on your screen. So as we hear from Brock and Dave, if you have any best practices, please share them, and we'll try to get back to them toward the end if we can. So I guess the first one of these questions that we're hearing from our customers everywhere is, what are those personal views you have on what the industry does next to solve the challenge?
Well, from my perspective, there are a lot of tools that are being developed out there to really help enhance what we do with our lockout, tagout, and permitting systems. I can tell you internally at BASF, we have a self-developed isolation program, if you will, that where we can physically print out tags and all that. That doesn't relieve you from having to print, to make sure that isolation is appropriate. Same thing with permitting, with permitting, whether it's around a line break, isolation, a confined space entry, et cetera. We learn from what we've done in the past. We've been able to, rather than historically we would get a safe work permit and fill everything out each time and go through those. And we now have electronic systems that we're going to allow us to make those easier. Now, the devil's in the details on that, because those can be positive and negative. If you print out a permit that's already filled out, are you really thinking through everything on it, or are you just using it as a reminder that these are the things that have to be done? And so you can get into a quandary there, if you will, if you don't appropriately do that. So some of these tools are very advantageous. They help us do things better if we do them properly, and that's really the key on that. So
yeah, I think to Dave's point, I've seen some comments here too. Going the electronic route is something that we as industry are moving towards and adapting to. So the technology is going to be out there where you can scan a valve and then lock it out, and it can be you can kind of fill it out while you go. We're doing electronic permitting. We're trying to roll that out in one of our operations this year. So it's going to be a change, but I think it's going to provide another layer of protection to where you can see where you're at on that procedure versus having to rely on a piece of paper, which is we can miss things on there, but hopefully if you put everything on there, and you can't complete the LOTO until everything is checked, that you've gone through that valve and everything else. So I think those are things that we're just going to have to continue to adapt and learn new technologies, and really adapt to the electronic revolution here that's going on. So I think that's important. The other thing is when I think about LOTO and about permitting, it's around having that conversation, what we call JSA, a job safety analysis, filled out as part of the permit. And that's that conversation with the operations and the maintenance, or the operator to whoever's going to be doing the work, help understand what the actual risk is that's in that chemical or in that piece of pipe or that pump or what have you. I think that's the most important thing, that you truly evaluate all your risks outside of the LOTO as well, to make sure that the work itself, which is the most important thing, goes safely. And I think that's really important to me, that you have those conversations, and whether you use electronic system or paper system, whatever you use, that conversation part and having people talk face to face is extremely important.
Yeah. And I will reiterate something Brock said earlier also. Having all of your P&IDs and equipment files and all that, having that correct and up to date, and a robust MOC process really work hand in hand with this. If you don't have good P&IDs and they're not maintained well, you're not going to be successful with lockout tagout. It's that simple.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. So I guess taking that into the next one, with all the risk and all the change going on, you guys talking about how we have to be continual learners. As industry, I think we all know that, an industry that works together beyond our individual companies will be better, and what are other ways beyond what we're doing today, which I think is a wonderful first step and the reason we kick this off. Are there other venues and ways we can share best practices, not just within our company, but among industry, that you guys see or have done?
Yeah, some of the industry groups, we will share, we'll share incidents that have happened, things like that. I think that's key to, there's very few things safety wise that are not considered shareable amongst companies, and that's really the key part of it. I think in when we get together in those situations to, for lack of a better term, commiserate, but I think we find we all face a lot of the same issues. So, when I look at what we're seeing on the Gulf Coast, which is where I am, and it may be different where you are in Brock, but the Gulf Coast wise, we're facing an onslaught of industry activity, whether it be from natural gas liquefaction and the LNG export facilities to feed Europe, the carbon capture, things like that. We're going to have a lot of new people coming into this industry, plus that combined with a lot of the retirements of the quote experienced hands that make we have to continue to adapt to this. And a lot of the new employees coming into the realm don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge, and really the hands-on type of activities that many of us had growing up. So we have to adapt our training. We have to adapt and make sure that the skill sets of the people who are doing the assessments are good.
And I do like forums like this. I think are important too, so the industry can come together to learn from each other. And if we could get to more, a workshop or some type of summit or whatever you want to call with industry leaders where we could learn from each other, I think that would be a great thing, because especially as you're starting to get more electronic tools, those are better things that work for others than don't work for certain companies, that we can learn from each other and share, because those are going to be important. The other thing is, I think I mentioned around just it's all about the culture and the behaviors you instill in your employees as they're brought in, but also as they've been into the industry. That's an important piece too, as well as we as leaders. I think that it's also important that you can provide good, both positive and negative consequences to people to help drive the culture that you want, where you get more of a peer-to-peer accountability is what I would say. That's when you have it, in my mind, when an operator is willing to stop another operator from doing something unsafe, or hey, I saw that you missed this valve in this LOTO, and make sure that it gets corrected before we turn it over to a maintenance employee. And so that's the important thing that I would say, is that we really take these pieces of, these procedures and policies to heart, understand the hazards, and then we really hold each other accountable, not just relying on myself or my managers or my shift supervisors to provide the consequences, that the actual operators to operators are actually providing those consequences to each other.
No, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Clint.
Go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
No, the other thing, I saw somebody had put a note in the chat box around safety interlocks and process interlocks and things like that. Over the years, these have become more complex, and oftentimes just having our operators isolate equipment without getting the instrument techs, without getting some of the electrical and computer-based folks involved, we do also get in situations. So as you know, as these continue to get more complex, we have to do that as well, because these may not show up on the P&IDs. You know, some companies put them on and some don't. So that was a great point, and I appreciate whoever put that in there. So.
Yeah, wonderful points, and good. It's a good segue, Dave, talking about some of the feedback we've gotten. So we've heard a lot. We're going to close the poll now and talk about the feedback. We'll start sprinkling in questions. Please, you guys, if you have any questions, throw them in the Q&A. We'll try our best to get to them. I will say we've had quite a lot of feedback through the several avenues, so which is good. I guess we'll just start with one of the first questions that came through. Dave, if you could maybe address one of the comments was the pandemic seems to have affected some of the industry performance. Have you seen things like, have you guys seen this, and why do you believe we've seen that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective at BASF, you know, and I'm sure most other industry, we all did the same thing when the pandemic came up. You know, we needed to run our plants, and many of our plants serve the industries that really we address some of the pandemic, the surfactants, the cleaners, things like that. We make a lot of effort to protect our core folks who run these plants to keep the product flowing and keep it flowing safety. In doing so, however, we isolated these folks a little bit from management and from some of that constant oversight and reminders. So what we saw, actually initially our safety got better. And you say, well, and because we weren't doing as much, we weren't, we were delaying some of the things that we may have done at other times because we didn't want to expose people. But as we're getting back to quote whatever normal is, the new normal, we're reintroducing some of that management oversight. We are seeing just a bit of an uptick in some of these mistakes. I think people have adapted over time to I don't want to say sloppy practices, but practices that they shortcuts or things like that they may not have taken in the past. So it's we're going through what we call a back to basics evaluations here at BASF, where we're reinforcing some of the things that we're doing and making sure that the basic things that we do we're taken care of. So.
Yeah, no, agreed for sure. So, Brock, how about this one for you? It says it's kind of reiterates what we said before with the how long the standard's been around and violations are high. What other systems, official systems, have you guys seen that are put in place, whether they're compliance systems or people-based solutions that work the best for you guys?
I think it's really just, for me, I don't know if it's necessarily a system. That you have to, as an owner, again, I'll go back to, I've said it probably 5 times already, but it's around the behaviors that you instill in your team when you start, and then also reinforcing those throughout the course of their career. And so for me, it's the audit. I think Dave mentioned about audits that we do, making sure your operations teams, your maintenance teams, your contractors are also auditing and providing feedback to the operations teams when we find things right, but also when we find things that aren't correct, and then addressing those, and then also teaching and educating those employees on what happened and correcting that situation. I think it's important to be open and honest with your teams about what you find, and see if there's common themes too, where maybe there's a misunderstanding in a policy or procedure that you just need to train on more, or need to reinforce more, and find what are those things that you can provide instant feedback. Because I think those, to me, it's more of a behavior thing, and how do you provide a consequence that's positive more often than the negative, and how do you do that in a good way? So, hey, you just completed a LOTO, great job, thank them, put them on the back. Hey, when you did this LOTO, you got everything correct, great job. And then the next time, hey, I see your LOTO before you put somebody to work. Hey, you missed a step here. That's why we have the verifier on our permits. I don't know if everyone does that, but we have a multiple energy source procedure where one person writes the procedure, and there's another person who's usually a supervisor or somebody who's a subject matter expert verifies that the procedure is done correctly. And so really taking that to heart and having those verifications provide that feedback to the employee. I think that's where I see the biggest advantage and improvement from a lot of perspectives lies is in that piece. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Totally agree. So next question that's coming, I'm going to try to combine several comments into one. A lot of feedback coming in on blinds and how to manage those from the attendees. It talks about best practices or process around managing blind and or spool type removal. Is there a tracking system? Is there an industry standard that you guys implement? What have you seen work or not work to prevent gaps in pulling the wrong blind mid isolation, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, blind management is that could be a whole other topic for rather lockout tagout. From our perspective, there's a lot of issues around blinds. Anytime we install a blind, we also track that on our isolation process, so that we make sure that we put them in the right place, and then also that we remove them. We also use what we call blind streamers. One of the things that just in case, which are literally just a 3-4 foot long fluorescent streamer to make sure that they are visible. Because once you put a blind in a process, if someone doesn't install a tag on that and track it, you could lose sight of the fact that it's there. Some of them are not highly visible. And you want to make sure that you do take them out as well as when you get them. Now, as far as where to install them and all that, that's, we treat installation of a blind as we would any other line break. There's an extra level of caution there for installing blinds.
And I think we also have we create a blind list too, for especially, I saw a lot of things about turnaround. So you go through and for each piece of equipment that you do a LOTO on, or that you're going to prepare for a confined space or what have you, we create a list, and it actually has a drawing of and where each one of those are located at, so that you physically know, and then you can also count to make sure that I have 10 blinds on this drawing, and I have 10 blinds here, and here's the location, and you can just check them off as you go. But the blind list is extremely important, as well as the final walk downs when you get ready to put something in service. I think those are extremely important. That's why you have those knowledgeable person walking down with that same piece of paper and looking for that blind's not there, that blind's not there. But we use a similar type thing as David says he does with the streamers, or sometimes we put tags depending on if they're part of a LOTO or a confined space, we do that as well. But our blind list is probably one of our best practices, and then our PSM checklist prior to us starting things up to have the extra set of verification steps.
Okay, looking at there was an earlier question toward the beginning. So have you guys ever seen instances where it's maybe beneficial for timeliness or for safety, where you guys would use mostly tags with as few locks as possible? And what would those situations be, and or why?
So yeah, if you've got a highly complex system, I mean, we do a lot with BASF with tag out. When you start talking about a lot of valves up at heights and a lot of valves in pipe racks, things like that, that you have to close and isolate. From a risk standpoint, installing a lock, if you will, or device on a 36-inch water line can be very difficult. It can be cumbersome, etc. In many of those situations, we do use tags for those scenarios. And again, making sure we have the appropriate pull strength, things like that. We also, however, if we are using a tag out system and we have a quarter turn valve, we do deploy a what we refer to as 1+ isolation, which is basically to make sure that if a scaffold builder is up there with a 2x4 and hits the handle, they don't inadvertently operate it. So that would mean that we would use, in our case, 125-pound braided tie wraps to secure that handle or remove that handle as necessary to make sure there's not inadvertent operation. Same thing you would get with a chain if you did the same type of thing. So.
Yep, wonderful, great. Yeah, all feedback. So as we're getting close and starting to wrap up here, the one thing, and I think Brock spoke to it earlier, but I think it's important, so I will recall the question a little bit. But when the lockout tagout violation is found, how do you treat that to avoid future violations from being covered up or hidden, to almost reward that self-reporting instead of, punishing people or driving reporting underground, which can have hidden dangers as well?
Yeah, I think for me, especially if it's self-reported, the recognition of that is important, not necessarily the punishment. And so I think it's important that you recognize individual for recognizing it. Hopefully it was before they did any work, but that's the most important thing, is that you don't want to put somebody in harm's way. But I think that's the most important thing, is you want to create a culture where people are not afraid to, raise their hand and say, hey, I made a mistake, or somebody else tell that person about it. And I think that's the most important thing. I will say it can be difficult, though, because you're either going to admit that you did something wrong or that your fellow employee did. But it's extremely important that you recognize when that does happen and when that report does come through. And I think it's a challenge, but I think it's something you have to do, and it's why we're in the roles we're in. All of us on this call is as leaders is to recognize that and to help people understand that we appreciate when you are detail oriented and you do go above and beyond and you do make sure that the work is safe, that we want to take that time to say thank you at a minimum.
Yeah, there's really no value in bayoneting the wounded in those scenarios, because that the reporting of those is to help you get better. But you also, the other thing we do, though, is we do have those, and they do occur, is we look at trends. And if the trends are occurring, for example, because MOCs are not well done, then we want to address that. So if it's lack of understanding by our third parties, and you have to recognize that we all do things differently. If in my plant, you cannot remove a valve with a locker red tag on it, but in some refineries in particular, they allow that, and you have to recognize that is part of our training that is pointed out, that's not absolutely a non-starter, is to take any piece of equipment out that has an isolation on it. So.
No, well, that's all great feedback. I want to thank everybody for their time. Also respect people for their time. And close, thank the group. Fran, any closing thoughts that you want to do? And then we'll go to Dave and Brock for further closing if you want.
Yes. So we're getting a lot of good information in the chat. We got a lot of responses from the poll question. I'll share a couple. Great comments by David and Brock around culture. That's a common theme through some of the poll question feedback. Culture, creating a positive environment for raising concerns. Several comments around good training and auditing, coaching, verification of competency. So again, we'll share this after the webinar to all the attendees. And again, there's a lot of great comments in the chat as well. We'll download that and send that out to the attendees as well. So with that, David, Brock, any last comments before we close?
I guess from my perspective, I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I was fortunate enough to be on the front end of it. And I'll say 33 years later, I haven't solved it 100% of the way, but we're going to continue to work to do it. So.
I also appreciate the opportunity, and also just the great comments that people put in the chat here. Just been reading through those, and it's always good for me. You can always say you're an expert, but nobody really is an expert. So I think we all learn from each other. So if we're willing to learn from each other, I think that's the most important thing. And that's what I definitely wanted from this, is it to be as much interactive as you can in these sort of webinars. And so I appreciate everyone's comments here. I think it's something that we should all take some of this feedback and try to apply universally, because I did see a comment here recently around we all do things slightly different. And so if we're going to be really advance the game, do we need to be more consistent? I think that's a good challenge to us. So I appreciate that. And thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, great. David, Brock, Clint, thank you all. And for all our attendees, thank you. Again, we will send all this information out via email so you all have it. So again, thank you, and that concludes our webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.